display. Apple's one and only 15-inch laptop, though it's available in a couple of different configurations. The integrated graphics model is $19.99. It is not cheap, and it has Intel Iris Pro graphics. We have the dedicated graphics model here, the more interesting one, because as you guys know, Apple finally did a GPU refresh. Apple and Dell with the XPS 15 have been riding on that NVIDIA GT 750M for 2 generations now, so it was certainly time for a change. We still have Intel Haswell 4th generation quad-core 28-watt CPUs in here, the more powerful workstation-y kind of CPU. Why don't we have Broadwell? Because Intel doesn't have Broadwell ready yet in quad-core mobile CPUs for anybody. It's not an Apple issue. It's not a Dell issue. It's not a Lenovo issue. This is Intel. At this point, we're guessing they might just skip Broadwell altogether, and we mean other manufacturers, not just Apple, and go straight to Skylake, which would be the 6th generation, sometime next year. So for those of you who are thinking, well, I should wait a month because it's going to happen. No, you know, Apple doesn't refresh their laptops that quickly. Typically, once a year, they kind of do a significant refresh. Sometimes they do a little CPU bump at the 6-month mark. So I don't expect anything to be happening real soon with this guy. If you're shopping for it now, unless you want to wait until 2016, probably we're not going to see any significant changes here. We're not going to spend too much time talking about the casing, the build quality, all that stuff. This is the same design Apple's been using, well, really, since they first came out with this in 2012, this version of the 15-inch model. Still, as ever, beautiful aluminum unibody design, perfect fit and finish. It's the apex of how a laptop should be made. 0.71 inches thick or thin, depending on how you want to look at it, and 4.49 pounds. God knows what they did to just make sure it didn't hit 4.5 pounds there, right? But let's call it 4.5 pounds, which is extremely light for a 15-inch laptop that has such powerful internals. This is no Ultrabook in here with the ULV CPU, after all. You've got the same CPUs you would find in a gaming laptop, a serious mobile workstation. It's pretty impressive. And on the side, the ports haven't changed either. We have our MagSafe connector for charging. It uses the 85-watt Apple charger. 2 Thunderbolt 2 ports here. They also work as mini display ports. And yes, you can use them both simultaneously if you want. You can use that with Apple's Thunderbolt display. You can use this with other monitors via mini display port. USB 3.0 port. Apple does not color code them because all 2 of them, golly, there's 2 of them, that's all there are USB 3.0. The combo mic headphone jack, and the laptop, like most laptops, has dual built-in mics also, and a webcam up top, as they call the FaceTime camera. It's 720p. The usual sculpted, easy to lift spot right here, so you can open it up. Gorgeous looking. Should be for the price, yeah? Your SD card slot right there, full-size HDMI, and the second USB port right there. You could call this not super duper generous with ports, but I think it's actually doing pretty good. You got many display ports plus your HDMI port going on there. The only thing you don't have is Ethernet, but given the fact that there are 2 Thunderbolt ports on this side, even if you're using like a Thunderbolt display or a Thunderbolt hard drive, you can use the Thunderbolt Ethernet adapter, which is a lot faster than the USB one, to have Ethernet if you need it. Bottom, as always, pentalobe screws hold everything in place. Not really designed to be user serviceable. The only thing that you can swap out is the SSD drive if you want. They're using a real fancy new Samsung-made PCIe SSD in here that is wickedly faster than anything they've used before, and they've always been at the forefront of SSD storage for several years now, so that says a lot. Rubber feet right there. Like I said, we're not going to show you any internal pictures here because this is not something that's really designed for you to service, even if you're kind of on the geeky side, other than perhaps swapping in a new SSD drive. And now for the required size comparison. This is the 13-inch Retina MacBook Pro on top of the 15-inch Retina MacBook Pro. 2-inch size difference there, obviously, and about a pound difference between them. So surprisingly, not that much of a difference. 3.5 pounds, 4.5 pounds right there. This guy here has a 28-watt CPU. It's a dual core, though not a quad core, so not as powerful, half the cores. For those of you who need a lot of computing power, working the pro apps all day long, obviously the 15-inch could be a better choice. We did a Smackdown a year ago or more. If you guys are dying to see another Smackdown with the updated Macs, just give a shout out in the comments, and it will happen. And just to be a little comical here, here is the 12-inch MacBook with Retina display wearing this nifty X-Gear carbon fiber vinyl skin on top of it. So size difference right there. So mini me, middle me, big me, whatever you want to call it. There's a whole stack of Macs. And now we have the latest edition of the Dell XPS 15. This is the 4K display one that we just reviewed, well, gee, about a week ago or so. And different display aspect ratio, the usual 16:9 widescreen on the Dell versus 16:10 on the Mac means the Dell's going to be a bit longer, as you can see. It is a bit longer. They're both very light. They're both relatively thin. Dell XPS 15, also often called the Windows MacBook. So you get the idea there. And you know, we could go further into this one, but we're going to have a separate comparison for those of you who are trying to decide between these two and aren't particularly married to one operating system or the other. They are priced the same. So look forward to that smackdown too. So you guys can see, and gals, which one we have in for review. Here we have the higher end model. Actually, the base clock speed for the $2,500 dedicated graphics model is 2.5 gigahertz. Quad-core i7. We actually have the slight speed bump. That one's going to run you $200. That's 2.8 gigahertz with turbo boost to 4 gigahertz. When you hit 4, it sounds like really impressive, doesn't it? Anyway, 16 gigs of RAM is standard on all these models. It is soldered on now, so you're not going to upgrade it, but 16 gigs should be enough for most folks. And you can see here we have Intel Iris Pro because this has switchable graphics. It will switch under Mac OS 10 Yosemite, not under Windows. It's only going to use a dedicated GPU there, and it's using the Iris Pro graphics. So just in case you're wondering about whether we really have a dedicated GPU in here, we'll show you the details. And you can see there the AMD Radeon R9 M370X with 2 gigs of GDDR5 dedicated memory. You can see the model number they're using there. So there it is. You know, it's interesting because it's using a model ID that Apple has used before for the AMD Radeon, but that doesn't mean this is the same as something from 2-3 years ago exactly. Obviously, AMD has tweaked this and gotten higher performance out of it, so don't have too much of a cow over that. This has the same wonderful keyboard that we've come to love on the 15-inch Retina MacBook Pro. Nothing changed there. Has backlighting. Stereo speakers flanking on the side there. Smart place to put them. They have enough room to put something over there like speakers, and so they do. Very nice sound. Again, those speakers aren't changed either. And one thing that has changed is the trackpad. We have the Force Touch trackpad, which we covered on the 13-inch Retina MacBook Pro that just came out this year. So you have the shallow press and then the deeper press, which can actually make something happen. You can tap on a word to get a definition. You can press on a link to get a preview, for example, and it's clicky everywhere. So it's not like your average trackpad that's hinged at the top and only the bottom half clicks. You can click anywhere here and you'll feel the click. It's very nice. It's more than a gimmick, and I find I use Force Touch a whole lot. Particularly, it allows for more precision, and when you're doing something, say, trying to navigate through some text and pick an edit point. I used to use just tap to click, but then you know, your finger wanders a little bit. With this, it's a nice gentle click. It's quite precise. Works pretty well, and I've stopped using tap to click and started to use Force Touch instead. It's also using the same 15.4-inch Retina IPS display, 99% of sRGB you can see there, and 74% of Adobe RGB, so right up there with all the top laptops. Color calibration was particularly good out of the box. After running our Spider 4 Pro colorimeter on this, I could not see a difference between calibrated and uncalibrated. That's how good they've gotten the calibration and the Delta E on this. So for you graphics professionals, this kind of just plug in and play and go, and you're going to see the proper colors on the display. Brightness is 300 nits. The resolution is 2880 by 1800. That's a 16 by 10 aspect ratio. And as always, Apple does a very good job of scaling, which means that you don't end up with, like you do in Windows land, and you might see a little of this when we switch to the Windows on the Mac portion of this. You're never going to run into like ultra tiny text you can't see or fuzzy text. The one thing that doesn't thrill me a whole lot is the 1440 by 900 relative resolution, because they're trying to do it for the best performance, and doing it as a multiple of the actual physical resolution. But you can see right here we're actually running at the equivalent of 1650 by 1050 right now, and I like to run it at 1920 by 1080. I still have pretty decent eyes, and you can see everything is still pretty readable like that. And honestly, with 15-inch Windows laptops, I run them at that resolution too, or that equivalent resolution with display scaling. But you have your choice here, and we'll just show you what default looks like. Default looks kind of huge now, doesn't it? Once you get used to seeing those smaller resolutions, I bet nobody actually uses that. We'll go back to the 1650 size, so make everything easier for you guys to see on screen here. Okay, so not a lot has changed. Obviously, on the outside of this computer, the port is to design the display itself. You guys want to know about benchmarks, don't you? Well, here's our Geekbench 3 score. 3953 single core, 15,143 for the multi-core score because, well, you got 4 cores right there. That is a very respectable score. And again, that's the 2.8 gigahertz Core i7 that we have in here. The 2.5 gigahertz shouldn't be that far different. That makes it, in terms of computational speed, CPU-bound things, one of the fastest laptops on the market. It's right up there with the collection of other quad-core i7s in Windows land. Mobile workstations, the Dell XPS 15 as well. The Lenovo ThinkPad W550, not the 550S that we reviewed. That one actually uses Ultrabook CPUs, but you get the idea there. But how about graphics? Now, because this is a new graphics card, and because Mac benchmarks are not always the strongest things, we're going to have a big visit to Windows land here, so you can see some more benchmarks, and you can watch us play Tomb Raider as well at 1920 by 1200 resolution to see how it goes there. And I won't spoil that. You'll wait for that part, won't you? So here's our Uni-Engine Heaven benchmark, and you can see average frames 35.4, score 891. And that's running at 1440 by 900 equivalent resolution, obviously because the display panel is higher. So that is a pretty good number. How does it compare to the last generation, though? That's the good question, isn't it? On the last generation model for the same test, we got a score of 21 frames per second. So that is a significant jump. And with the Dell XPS 15 latest generation as well, with the same GPU as the old 15-inch MacBook Pro with retina display, that one scored 24 frames per second. So we're up to 35.4. Looks like things are getting better here. Now, Apple claimed 80% improvement. And you know, Apple, when they claim things about battery life, they're usually right on target. When they claim things about performance, they're as optimistic as any manufacturer. It really is going to depend on what test you run. Obviously, for some tests, you'll see a 20, 30, 40%. The odd test, maybe you'll see 80%. We haven't seen anything as good as 80%, but we have seen a significant test in most everything that is taxing up to moderate levels. You'll see some of our Windows benchmarks where we got into the most difficult tests, and then it kind of flattens out, and we don't see as much improvement there as we do for the mid-level tests. Is it fast enough to run Windows games at decent settings and 1920 by 1200 resolution? Yeah, it is. Now, while we're talking about benchmarks, another thing comes up, heat and fan noise. If you do crazy things like we do, which is to say spend 8 hours, 9 and off running benchmarks, we do give it some time to cool in between. You got to be fair with a laptop because they do get toasty, especially if they're thinner lights. It's just as loud as the outgoing generation. It's not any louder. It's not any hotter either. I know some people say, you know, AMD, they're less efficient, yada, yada. In this case, for what they've built for the MacBook Pro here, it's not any hotter. It doesn't seem to have any thermal issues any worse than NVIDIA had. Playing games actually gets it a little bit hotter. Now, playing Tomb Raider, for example, and Battlefield 4, here at the keyboard area, and this is where, you know, you'd expect hopefully heat to be really shooting out the bottom more than the top. The keyboard will get up to about 109 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, we use a thermal gun to actually shoot this guy and measure the temperature, so you know that's where we're getting our figures from. The bottom 105 degrees, the hottest part was 111 degrees, right dead center, right below here. So it can get toasty if you're doing things like playing games. If you're using this in the normal land of Mac tasks, even using the Pro apps, we use Final Cut on this, for example, Adobe Photoshop 6 and CC, it doesn't get nearly that hot. You don't hear the fan very often. If you're rendering 1080p video or 4K video in iMovie or Final Cut or Premiere, and it's longer than a 3-minute clip, yes, you're going to hear the fan come on. It's not going to be a vacuum cleaner, but it's going to come on. It will not get alarmingly or unpleasantly hot. We're talking about playing games and running benchmarks. That's when this guy can sizzle. The similarly designed Dell XPS 15 gets equally as hot and sometimes a bit hotter. So nothing has changed basically in thermal land. That's what you need to know there. In Cinebench R15, running it on the Mac side of the house, the GPU tests 65.77 frames per second, which isn't much different from the outgoing GT750M. What's going on there with Cinebench and with the particular GPU, really, we can't say. Considering every other test showed an improvement, take it out for what it's worth. CPU scored 619. Since the CPU here is not so different from the outgoing model, we don't expect to see a difference there. Tomb Raider for the Mac in the benchmark at 1440 by 900 resolution. It averaged 46.6 frames per second. The benchmark on the PC side for Tomb Raider, running it under Windows, was at 1920 by 1200, considerably higher resolution, 62 frames per second. So you get the difference there. Games actually play better under Windows, generally speaking. That's because many of the games are just ports for the Mac, so they're not particularly well optimized. Other standard features with the Mac include dual band Wi-Fi 802.11ac. It's a Broadcom chip and it is very strong. I was really very impressed. Even on the Windows side of the house here, we got one of the fastest connections that we've seen with our Wi-Fi AC router among all the laptops that we've reviewed. Good stuff there. Bluetooth 4.0 is also standard. Like I said, Apple had already very fast PCIe storage in here, and they've switched to something even faster. We'll show you the benchmarks on the Windows side. Wickedly fast SSD. You can really actually notice the difference when you're doing things like moving a lot of files. Say if you do video editing, you know what it's like to have to move big files around, doing big software installs, stuff like that. Day-to-day use otherwise, if you're just launching Word or Excel or a website, you probably won't notice the difference so much. It's really for those of you who move big files around or do a lot of software installs, but it is faster. So now we're going to switch over to the Windows side so we can see some more benchmarks. Again, usually when we review Macs, we don't really get so geeky into the benchmarks. It's really more about the experiential side of how it is to use the Mac and what improvements there are here. But in this case, because of the new mysterious graphics processor that is of such interest to many of you who are thinking about upgrading, well, there's a lot of good tests under Windows, and of course gaming under Windows that we're going to take a look at now. For those of you who are interested in the 1999 model with Intel Iris Pro graphics, that's the same stuff as the 2014 basically you're looking at there. Because we're still with the Intel Haswell generation, like I said, Intel hasn't come out with Broadwell. Skylake's a ways off still. So for those of you who already have a 2014 or 2013 edition, there's probably no reason to upgrade unless you're interested in those dedicated graphics. So we're going to take a look at them in depth now in Windows land. So once again, because this new graphics card, the AMD Radeon R9 M370X with 2 gigs of GDDR5 VRAM is such an unknown quantity, we've run about every test you can. So we've seen some Mac tests here, and now we're looking at Windows because there's a lot more really heavy-duty benchmarks available under Windows. First off, this is 3D Mark 11, and that's the P number right there, 3975. That compares to about 2960 for the previous generation 15-inch MacBook Pro with retina display and dedicated graphics with the NVIDIA GT750M. So for those of you who are wondering if there's an improvement, well, yes, there is certainly an improvement there. You know, Apple is just not going to say, gee, let's put in the same performance in a new model, would they? You expect something has to get better here. Now, interestingly, running the extreme test, it scored X988, which isn't much better than the GT750M and is about the same as the Dell XPS 15, also running on the 750M. So go figure. We noticed a theme here. With a lot of the tests, if there were middleweight to challenging middleweight tests, there was a noticeable improvement, but the harder the tests got, the more extreme, more, say for a gaming PC, then the numbers kind of flatten out and the improvements were smaller there. So hard to say what is going on exactly with that. But for your middle performance tasks, i.e. you're not going to be using this to play Dragon Age Inquisition at high settings, which really it's not designed for primarily. If you're using this for the usual pro apps kind of stuff, then you're going to see the improvement there. For the latest edition of 3D Mark, you can see here we have our Fire Strike test results 2203. That's one of the more demanding tests, so not a bad result there. And at 2203, it's a bit above what we see with the GT 750M, which was around 2000, so improvement there. Now, Ice Storm Extreme, that number is a huge improvement. See what I mean about the tests that are not as heavyweight there? That one's a less challenging test, 102,000 and 246, compared to around 59 to 60,000 for the outgoing MacBook Pro with the dedicated GPU or the Dell XPS 15, also, again, with the same configuration, basically, as that Mac outgoing model with the 750M graphics. So, serious improvement there. For the CloudGate test, also in 3D Mark latest edition, 11,672. That shows an improvement as well over the outgoing model, which was around 10,500. So this is also a more challenging test, CloudGate, one of the harder ones. So again, the improvement narrows there relative to the easier tests. PC Mark 8 Home accelerated test, 36,028, which is about 1,000 points higher than the outgoing model, and again, higher than the XPS 15 with the same 750M as the outgoing Mac model. So yes, folks, there are improvements here. Apple wasn't just trying to get us to drink some crazy sauce there. Is it going to compete with an Alienware? No, it's not. It's not for that. But really, this is designed more for the pro apps, and it's doing a good job there. Lastly, the crazy fast PCIe SSD in here, the latest, greatest, fastest version where Apple claims it's wickedly fast. I have never seen numbers that high before in Crystal Disk Mark, which measures SSD performance on a number of block size tests. You can see right there, those are just really high numbers. Now, the interesting thing is, I always say, who's going to notice the difference, honestly, unless you move a lot of files? Like, for example, I install loads of big, fat benchmarks in games, so I notice it a bit more when the SSD is faster. I have never seen big programs install as quickly as it does on this, so if you do move a lot of files around for whatever it is you're doing, say you're doing video editing, copying, and stuff like that, you will actually notice the difference here. It's something. And for those of you who are wondering, since this model wasn't such a huge change, Boot Camp drivers were available immediately for this, so we didn't have to wait for a couple of weeks for Apple to get them ready. Automatically loaded all the drivers that are necessary to run Windows, including the AMD Catalyst Control Center there, which is the latest version that is available. So we have good drivers here for our graphics test, and you can see that we are running Windows 8.1 Enterprise and actually the Evaluation Edition. Not that it really matters much, but you can see everything right there. Genuine Windows running on this Mac. Now, I've never been really thrilled about running Windows on the Mac because, especially with the 15-inch Mac, where power and heat concern is a little bit more of an issue, you actually are on dedicated graphics all the time, so you can't switch down to integrated graphics to save battery life and to keep it cooler. Also, the wonderful trackpad drivers and things that people go ooh and ah about with the Mac, well, they're just okay here in Windows land. They're not super duper. You get the idea. But I think a lot of you probably are interested in running Windows for a couple of programs that you might need for work and for gaming. So there you have it. And speaking of gaming, we're going to test Tomb Raider next. Okay, now we're going to test out Tomb Raider. We're doing the Windows version. This is available for Mac OS, and we will provide you with some benchmarks for how it did Mac OS benchmarking, but honestly, a lot of games run better under Windows. They're more optimized. Some of the Mac games are just, well, ports, you know. So we're going to take a look at Windows. That's probably where more of you are going to be playing games if you're seriously into gaming. So let's take a look at our settings first. 1920 by 1200. We're also running the desktop at that resolution, not because of the Mac, but because, generally speaking, a lot of Windows games in Steam get kind of upset if you're running at a high resolution on the desktop with scaling enabled. So it's much easier to just go, if you want to play in 1920 by whatever, to just go with that for your desktop resolution. You can see refresh rate 60 Hertz, double buffering is on, full screen. Quality normal, motion blur normal. Advanced, let's take a look at that. Everything is at normal. We got FXAA, anisotropic is set to 4x, so we're not holding back here with our settings at all. So let's see how it does. given the settings are pretty high, it's pretty good. Take a look around at our environment. Dark and dingy as always in this section. Let's see. Let's look for some wolves. Sorry, Fido. Frame rate's holding up really nicely. Anything above 30 frames per second is considered playable. I know a lot of even more hardcore gamers like something like 60 even. Given that this is not intended to be a gaming machine, it's not bad. And again, this is with the AMD Radeon R9 370 graphics. This is a new graphics chip for 2015. Clearly, it's not so bad, and it's actually getting me more frames here than it would have with the GT 750M outgoing. So that's Tomb Raider on the 15-inch Retina MacBook Pro with dedicated graphics, 2015 edition. Battery life, also interestingly, once again, like I said, AMD sometimes gets picked on for not having as good power efficiency and battery life. Well, Apple actually upped their estimated battery life estimates to 9 hours for the latest edition that we have here, and that's real interesting because it still has the same 99.5 watt-hour battery, which is a big battery inside. And you know, obviously it depends on what you do. When you're running on the Mac side, it switches between dedicated and integrated graphics as it sees fit. If you're running Photoshop, and you can turn this feature off if you want in Photoshop, and you'll still get pretty good performance because Intel Iris Pro graphics are pretty strong. You could turn off the dedicated graphics on the road if you needed to for performance. You also have control in the display control panel. Now on the Mac you can turn off dedicated graphics. When Apple quotes 9 hours, they mean dedicated graphics are not running because it will consume more power. This has always been true with the dedicated graphics on 15-inch MacBook Pros. Running it on integrated graphics and setting it to run on integrated graphics, we haven't reached 9 hours yet, but I have reached 8 hours. And we're still running tests on that. We've had this for several days now, not quite a week, and it takes a while to do a whole lot of battery tests on it. Now, if you're going to be using this and hitting the dedicated graphics card on the road to, say, process video or work on Photoshop, it's going to be more like 6 hours or so there. So among 15-inch, call them workstation class, professional class, quad-core laptops, that's very good battery performance. It obviously does not beat the 13-inch Retina MacBook Pro, which has much less powerful hardware, or the MacBook Air, which has even lesser hardware, but it's pretty good battery performance for a machine in this class. Well, so now you've seen a whole lot of benchmarks and some gameplay on the Windows 8.1 side of things. Even if you don't intend to use Windows on this Mac, those numbers are useful because you can compare them to a whole lot of other similar competing pieces of hardware in the Windows land and get an idea of what the performance gains are. Overall, yes, it is faster. Like I said, I mean, Apple is not going to upgrade the GPU and then give you the same level of performance. That makes no sense. Part of the reason I think they went with AMD is because they wanted that 5K output. I bet you there's going to be a 5K Thunderbolt display to match the Retina iMac out there. So those of us who don't use iMacs can actually have some 5K love. And beyond that, obviously, it depends on the benchmark you're running. But overall, we saw some significant improvements in performance there. I know a lot of gamers particularly wish that they went with the NVIDIA GTX 960M. That would have been really nice. 970 is really still in the area of gaming machines. Typically, these guys that are mobile productivity workhorses for professional use don't get something like the 970M or the 980M. Those stay in gaming laptops that have cooling built around them. But yeah, I wouldn't have minded seeing what the 950 or the 960M could have done in this, but honestly, it's performing quite well, and it's not a slouch by any means. And for those of you particularly who are using this for the pro apps, it delivers what you need, and it is an improvement